Hello and welcome to my intermediate online chess course. I hope you're all well. If you're looking for the advanced course, or the higher level course as I'm going to call it, then you can head over to those videos now. I'm just going to introduce the course first of all. I think you all know who I am, but I'm Marcus Gosling and I'm a chess teacher. Now I'm hoping, first of all, that you'll find time in your day to watch this video, but best to do it when you are able to concentrate fully. If you're doing it at night or maybe early in the morning when you don't concentrate too well, then I would avoid that. Better to do it when you've got full concentration, okay? Now, what makes you an intermediate player is the ability to move pieces safely, okay? So, for example, you would recognize when, if you put a piece on a square where it can be taken, then that would signify a beginner, okay? So I think most intermediate players are able to recognize when a piece can be taken. And when you get to a higher level, then the difference is perhaps a little bit smaller. You would be able to identify tricks on the board, tactics and strategy to a much higher level. So I think what we'll do in this course is we'll start with some sort of warm-up puzzles, just maybe one per lesson. Then we'll go into a kind of scenario. So I'm going to show you an example of something where hopefully you can learn something from it. I want this to be a challenge. So at the end of the lesson, I hope that you'll be able to learn something new. Okay. If you've got any questions, just let me know by an email or whatever. And we'll go into it. So starting off, first of all, with my warm-up puzzle, I'm going to share my screen, and I should appear in the top right-hand corner. There we go. So here's our puzzle. Notice I'm using Lichess to do this, so you can also make use of that. So quite a typical example of an endgame. White has got 5 pawns. Black has got 5 pawns. White has a bishop and a knight, and black has 2 knights. Now, I'm sure you intermediate players can work out that material, or the number of pieces, and their value is equal at the moment. Some people would say that the bishop is a tiny bit better than the knight, and I would agree in this situation because the bishop has lots of room to maneuver, room to move. So white does this move, and he attacks, or they attack this knight. Now notice this knight is not protected. So black could simply move the knight out of the way, something like that. That would be perfectly fine. But actually black makes a little mistake. They do this move. And I'd like you to pause the video now and see if you can work out the solution to this puzzle. The idea is for white to win material, to win points, okay? So pause the video now. Okay, hopefully you've had sufficient time to come up with a way for white to win material. The answer is this, pawn to f5. Now notice that this knight is defending its friend. But the problem is that if the knight here moves, let's say it moves away, then white will be able to take this knight for free. And that's not good. So this means that we have 2 different threats. We have bishop takes knight and pawn takes knight. And unfortunately, black can't deal with both of them. Black may have to simply leave the knight there to be taken or move this one away. So well done if you got that answer. I'm now going to go on to a scenario. Okay. Now again, you may want to pause the video because firstly I'd like to ask you guys what the material situation is. So pause the video and see if you can tell me whether white's winning on material, black's winning, or whether material or pieces are equal. Pause the video. Okay, material is equal in this game. Just to let you know, this is from a World Championship game about 50 years ago, and lots of maneuvering has been going on in this game. Lots of maneuvering with knights and bishops, and not a whole lot really has happened apart from that, to be honest. But all of a sudden, White is starting to decide to make some progress. Now, it's quite difficult to do that because Black's pieces are quite well placed. What would you say is White's main advantage in this position? I think, to be honest, White's control of the centre is quite an important factor in this game. Notice, though, that if White does move either of these pawns forward, then they can be captured immediately by at least one or two of Black's pieces. So at the moment, these pawns are relatively stuck, but it doesn't mean that they're not strong. They're working together and they're controlling quite a few squares. Notice particularly this square is quite valuable to White. Now, we're playing as Black here, and White makes a small mistake in this game, which I'm about to show you. And your job will be to use your understanding of tactics, such as pins, forks, skewers, and discovered attacks, to work out a way for Black to take advantage of White's mistake. If you don't recognize any of those words that I've just mentioned, probably best to pause the video and just look them up. You can look them up online, type in chess fork or chess skewer, and you can you can learn a bit more that way. Okay, I'm going to play the move that that White did in this game. He goes like this. Whoops, knight to e3. That looks quite good because it looks like this knight is potentially coming to this square, maybe. Maybe it's going to come here, possibly even support a push forward using this pawn a bit later. Looks like a good move, but unfortunately this is a small mistake. And I'd like you to try to work out why that is. Pause the video and spend a minute or so trying to work it out. Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with pins in chess. Now notice that this rook here is not protected by anything, which makes it weak. It's currently defending its pawn here, and we're attacking this pawn once. But notice that this pawn is pinned. If it moves off the file, if it, for example, takes anything, if anything lands here, then it can't really take it, because it means that Black will have a free route down to White's rook here. Okay? I'm hoping that you saw this move, pawn to c5. Now, White cannot take. If he does take, then Black will come down there and capture the rook. So that would be more or less game over for White. So they cannot do that move. Instead, White creates what's called a passed pawn. A passed pawn is a pawn which has passed, literally, the pawns on either side of it. So notice that this pawn cannot stop the one next to it. There's no pawn here to stop the pawn from getting further. So that's quite a strong pawn. But the downside is that notice what colour square are all of White's pawns on. They're all on the same colour. They're all on light squares, which means the dark squares around these pawns are actually quite weak. It means because notice that White has only got a light squared bishop, a bishop that can only operate on light squares. He doesn't have a dark squared bishop. That's already been swapped off. And that means that we can take advantage by getting one of our pieces, perhaps, in amongst these dark squares here. Okay? So pause the video and see if you can work out a move here that was played by black to take advantage of these weaknesses on the dark squares. So the move that was played was this one, knight to e5. And that's a nice move because notice from that position, the knight is going to be quite hard to get rid of. Yes, well, perhaps white could try to do it this way and attack the knight like this. But to be honest, the knight here is well supported. It's supported by a pawn, and it's going to be quite hard for it to be removed. Notice that the knight from this position is controlling several squares in white's territory. And that makes it harder for white to maneuver and to move his pieces. Let's see what white does in response to this. Well, white plays this move, rook across to f1. Bit of a strange move, you might think. Well, it is. But the idea is that white is also looking for a weakness in black's position. And this pawn here is weak. The reason is that it's behind its friends here. If it moves up, then it's going to be captured immediately, and it's only protected by the king. So if white can pile up lots of attacks on this pawn, then that will be advantageous. It'll be very good. So let's see what happens. I think here a move that you may not see is bishop g6. The idea there is to clear some space to protect this pawn. So, for example, the rook can move across to protect the pawn, and therefore black would have two defenders, and that would be enough. Notice that white will continue with his plan, but at the moment white is only attacking this pawn once, so we don't really need to defend it at another time just at the moment. You'll see in a second what happens, how black defends the pawn. I'm going to show you another strong move by black. Often if you're a bit stuck in a position, you're not really sure what to play, you can often ask yourself this question: which one of my pieces is not that well placed? Which one could I improve? Which one could join the battle a bit more? This is my question really, which one do you think, which piece could help black a little bit more than it is at the moment? Pause the video. I would look at this knight. Notice that I suppose black's rooks are defensive, but they are ready, they're doing a job. For example, this rook here is on the half-open file. It's potentially going to be attacking this pawn once the knight moves. And this rook here, similarly, is on a sort of a semi-open file, stopping white's pawn from moving too fast. I would argue that these rooks are nicely placed. The knight here in the center is very well placed. It's probably black's best piece. This bishop here, well, again, this is not a great bishop, but it is applying pressure on this pawn. And it's also trying to stop white's knight from coming in here. So I would argue that this is the only piece on black's team. When I say piece, I don't mean a pawn, I mean one of the big pieces. But it's perhaps one of black's only pieces that is not really contributing that much to black's position. So the question is, where would we like to move this knight? Now this is quite a tricky question. It doesn't actually have that many spaces at all. So I would say this: consider where you would move it in 2 moves' time. Imagine you could perhaps have 2 moves in a row and position the knight somewhere where it will be more useful to us. Okay? Pause the video and see if you can come up with an idea. I'm going to show you this move. Knight to c8. I guess you're probably asking why. But where could that knight go next? Well, I'll show you the answer in a second. I'm just going to play the next moves. Notice the white's attacking this. So what black does is he simply moves this across to defend the pawn. Okay. But on the next move, you'll see the reason for this. White moves his king into the middle, and the knight goes to here. Notice that we're putting a lot of pressure on the center. So, for example, this pawn is now quite weak because it's behind its friend, and it's going to have to be defended by other pieces. So we have two attackers, the bishop and the knight, and white has only got one defender, which is this bishop here. I think that it's going to be very hard for white to defend this pawn because notice that black's knight is controlling several of the squares around the enemy pieces. It means that this pawn is going to be hard to defend. The move that's played is, let's have a look, knight into here. White has to block this bishop. If he doesn't, he'll lose his pawn. Okay, and I'm just going to ask you one final question here, and then we'll wrap up. What do you think black does next? You can pause the video. Now, I think that if black moves his king, then white will simply capture this knight. And worse still, we're in a fork. So I think we can't avoid capturing this knight. If we don't capture, we'll lose. So we've got a choice. Either we take with the bishop, or we take with the knight. Now, I mentioned earlier that generally bishops are a little bit better than knights. For example, in that puzzle that I showed you earlier, because they can access different parts of the board very quickly. They can run from one end of the board to the other in a single move. It will take knights 3 or 4 moves to do that. But notice the number of pieces that are left on the board here. The center is fairly blocked up. It's going to be quite hard for white's bishop to maneuver around these pawns. Notice white's bishop is on the same color as his pawns. Compare that though to black's knights here. Black's knights are both very strong. They're operating from very good squares. Black's knights are putting pressure on enemy territory, okay? And potentially they could be supporting a move such as this. Notice that black may be able to create a passed pawn himself. On the queen's side, we have 3 pawns here against 2 enemy white pawns. So really what black will try to do is get these 2 pawns forward, okay? The answer, this is the final question, the answer is that black takes with the bishop. So that after this position, he can play this. And then there's no trouble for black on the king's side because these 2 rooks are blocked by the white pawn. All black now needs to do is transfer the rooks across to a nice open space such as this one and press on the queen's side using the knights and rooks and apply pressure on the queen's side. Now I'm going to pause that video again. Just if you want, you can look up this game. It was a game between Botvinnik and Petrosian in 1963. It's the 18th match, or the 18th game of the World Championship match. You can look that up if you want. You can look up the conclusion of the game on chessgames.com. It's a really good website. I would recommend that. Okay, I'm going to unshare my screen and say thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that little insight into well, some of the ideas that grandmasters use, and always keep an eye out for those tactics, pins, sometimes forks, and I think in the puzzle that we did at the beginning, well, that was a kind of a double attack. It was not a fork, but it was attacking two pieces with separate pieces. So those are always useful too. So see you next time, and stay tuned for more videos.